happened last night.
Be quiet! They are watching us!
January 1945. A bitter wind sweeps across the gray expanse of a makeshift Allied POW camp in northern France. Snow crunches under worn boots. Smoke from small fires curls into the overcast sky, carrying the acrid scent of wet wood and cold metal. Inside the wooden barracks, German women huddle together, faces pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. The camp is silent except for the occasional shout of a guard, the clatter of utensils, and the soft whimper of someone trying to hide trembling hands. Outside, the barbed wire gleams under the dim winter sun, a cold reminder of captivity. These women, once housewives, clerks, and nurses, are now prisoners of war, caught between a collapsing Reich and the uncompromising rules of their captors. Today, a new order arrives. All prisoners must have their hair cut. No exceptions. The women exchange anxious glances, the weight of humiliation pressing as heavily as the freezing air. For many, this simple act of enforced cleanliness will mark a turning point, an intimate, brutal reminder of the war's reach into every life. The question lingers: how far can control over the body become a weapon? By late 1944, the war in Europe had shifted decisively against Germany. Allied forces were advancing from the west, liberating territory that had been under Nazi control for years. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was pressing relentlessly, crossing rivers, towns, and forests, leaving entire regions in turmoil. Germany itself was crumbling, its cities bombed, infrastructure in ruins, and civilian morale at an all-time low. It was in this chaotic environment that many German women found themselves caught up in the machinery of war, often far from the battlefields they had once thought were distant. These women were no longer merely wives, mothers, or clerks. As the war dragged on, German policy had drawn women into roles that had previously been reserved for men. Some were auxiliary personnel in the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe. Others worked in factories producing weapons, and many were conscripted into labor programs supporting the Reich's war effort. Their lives, already constrained by rationing, air raids, and propaganda, became entwined with the fate of the collapsing state. When Allied forces began capturing German territory, civilians, men, women, and even teenagers were often rounded up as prisoners of war, either for intelligence purposes or to prevent further resistance. The Allies' approach to civilian and female POWs was shaped by both military necessity and public health concerns. Camps were established across liberated regions, intended to house thousands of prisoners in temporary barracks. Hygiene, sanitation, and the prevention of disease were critical priorities. Lice infestations, typhus, and dysentery were rampant in war-torn areas. These concerns, combined with the sheer scale of displaced persons, meant that the camps became tightly regulated environments, where control over even the smallest aspects of life, clothing, sleeping arrangements, and personal grooming, was strictly enforced. For German women, the transition from civilian life to prisoner status was abrupt and shocking. Many were unfamiliar with the concept of POW camps for women. Even soldiers captured in battle were often treated with greater autonomy than civilian women. Barracks were overcrowded, heating was minimal, and access to sanitary supplies was limited. The sudden imposition of strict rules, often enforced by young Allied soldiers or Red Cross staff, created a sense of helplessness. The women's identities, once tied to family, occupation, or personal appearance, were stripped away in an instant. It was against this backdrop that orders regarding personal hygiene, including the cutting of hair, were introduced. What may appear today as a simple measure of cleanliness carried with it layers of social and psychological impact. Hair, for these women, was deeply tied to identity and dignity. The act of cutting it, even for hygienic purposes, became a moment of humiliation and a stark reminder of captivity. The intention, from the Allied perspective, was practical: prevent lice, reduce the spread of disease, and facilitate the maintenance of large groups of prisoners under trying conditions. Yet the experience of the women subjected to this procedure was profoundly human, often traumatic, and deeply symbolic. Civilians and soldiers alike reported seeing the psychological strain manifest in subtle ways. Women clutching their remaining hair, murmuring to one another, or attempting to hide from inspection. In letters and post-war testimonies, many recounted the fear and shame of this enforced act. For some, it was a first confrontation with the total control exerted by the captors. For others, it became a symbol of the broader humiliation suffered by Germany's civilian population in the closing months of the war. This moment, seemingly minor in the scope of a global conflict, reflected the broader tensions of war, the collision of military necessity and human dignity. It highlighted the way ordinary people, especially women, were drawn into situations where survival required submission to rules imposed by strangers, in circumstances over which they had no control. The story of these German women, and the simple yet wrenching act of cutting their hair, cannot be understood without situating it within the larger context of 1944 to 45 Europe. A continent in chaos, a nation in collapse, and civilians caught at the intersection of necessity, authority, and compassion. This context sets the stage for exploring the camps themselves, the policies that govern them, and the lived experience of the women subjected to these measures. Across northern and western Europe, as Allied forces liberated towns and villages, makeshift POW camps for German civilians and soldiers were quickly established. These camps were often former schools, factories, or military facilities, hastily converted to house large numbers of prisoners. Barracks were wooden or brick structures, heated minimally, with rows of cots pressed close together. Sanitation was a constant concern. Outbreaks of lice, influenza, and gastrointestinal diseases threatened both prisoners and camp staff. Maintaining hygiene was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival. For women prisoners, the environment was particularly challenging. The majority had never been in institutional settings. Their daily lives before the war had revolved around home, family, or work. Now, every aspect of life was dictated by camp rules. Guard enforced schedules for meals, roll calls, and labor assignments. Privacy was non-existent. The Allied authorities, often operating under the supervision of the Red Cross, implemented strict measures to prevent disease from spreading. This included inspections, disinfecting clothing, delousing procedures, and, most controversially, the cutting of hair. The rationale behind haircutting was practical. Long hair in crowded conditions was a vector for lice and other parasites. Barbers or nurses would cut hair short, sometimes to uniform lengths, and then disinfect heads using hot water, chemicals, or simple soap scrubs. For the women, this procedure was often humiliating. Many had their hair styled in the fashions of pre-war Germany, a marker of femininity and personal identity. The sudden removal of these styles, sometimes leaving uneven or shorn patches, was an intimate invasion. Yet from the camp administrator's perspective, it was a necessary step to maintain order and prevent the rapid spread of disease. Reports from the period indicate that the process was carried out systematically, sometimes involving hundreds of women at a time. Camp records describe the procedures in clinical terms. Prisoners lined up, hair measured or cut, heads inspected for lice, and treated if necessary. Allied officers and nurses were aware of the emotional impact, but prioritization of public health often overrode consideration of personal dignity. In some instances, staff try to provide reassurance or allow women to keep small personal mementos, but the scale of the operation made individual care nearly impossible. These camps also reflected the broader political and military objectives of the Allies. The liberation of occupied territory brought both responsibility and logistical burden. Civilians and captured personnel were not only potential intelligence sources, but also symbols of the defeated German state. Their treatment, hygienic measures, supervision, and even enforced haircuts was meant to ensure control, prevent disease, and facilitate eventual repatriation or integration into post-war systems. The psychological impact of these measures, however, was profound. Many women described feeling stripped of autonomy, reduced to a body under the authority of strangers. In letters, diaries, and post-war interviews, former prisoners recalled the fear and confusion surrounding these routines. The sound of scissors and clippers, the smell of disinfectant, the sight of fellow women crying or muttering to themselves, all became etched into memory. Yet, even within this system, bonds of solidarity emerged. Women comforted one another, shared words of encouragement, and found small ways to retain dignity amid the procedures. Understanding this background, why camps were created, the rules imposed, and the reasoning behind enforced hygiene, frames the story of the haircutting not merely as an isolated act, but as a lens into the broader human experience of captivity. It was a moment where military necessity intersected with personal identity, with a practical goal of cleanliness collided with deeply rooted notions of dignity and selfhood. The stage is now set to examine these events from multiple angles: the human, tactical, moral, and psychological dimensions of this experience. How did the women endure? How did camp leadership justify their policies? And how did these procedures affect the broader narrative of wartime captivity? For the German women confined in these POW camps, the haircut represented more than hygiene. It was an intrusion into their identity. Hair, in the culture of 1940s Germany, was a marker of femininity, individuality, and pride. Long braids, curls, or meticulously styled buns were symbols of normalcy amid a world turned upside down. In the cramped barracks, the arrival of barbers and nurses with scissors and clippers triggered waves of anxiety. Women whispered to one another, clutching their hair, dreading the moment when it would be taken from them. Some attempted small acts of defiance, covering their heads with scarves or refusing to sit immediately, but the camp system allowed little room for personal choice. The psychological toll was immediate. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal that women experienced feelings of shame, helplessness, and vulnerability. Yet alongside fear, there was resilience. Groups formed quiet support networks. Older women comforted younger prisoners. They shared stories, braided each other's remaining hair, or exchanged words of encouragement, reinforcing human bonds in the face of institutional control. From the perspective of camp commanders and Allied officers, the haircutting policy was a matter of discipline, hygiene, and efficiency. Commanders faced the practical challenge of overseeing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of prisoners in cold, overcrowded conditions. Lice and other infestations spread quickly, risking both the health of prisoners and the camp staff. Officers documented procedures meticulously, scheduling haircuts, organizing lines, and coordinating disinfecting protocols. Orders were clear, often issued through formal memos or announcements. The objective was twofold: maintain sanitary conditions and establish authority. In the commanders' minds, strict enforcement of hygiene policies reinforced the overall discipline of the camp. Any perception of laxity could compromise health, safety, and order. From a logistical standpoint, the act of cutting hair short simplified maintenance. It allowed for easier inspections and reduce the risk of lice transmission in the dense living quarters. The morality of enforced haircuts was a subject of quiet debate even among Allied personnel. On one hand, there was a clear practical necessity. Crowded conditions demanded measures to prevent disease outbreaks. On the other hand, cutting hair was profoundly intimate, invasive, and humiliating. Nurses and officers often struggled with the tension between duty and empathy. Reports from camp staff indicate that some were uneasy, recognizing the emotional and psychological impact on women, while others adhered strictly to orders, seeing personal discomfort as secondary to military objectives. This ethical tension reflected broader dilemmas in wartime policy. The Allies were liberators, yet in controlling prisoners, they exerted power in ways that could be interpreted as degrading. Haircutting became a focal point for these moral questions. Was it a necessary sanitary measure, or an avoidable act of humiliation? For the women involved, these distinctions mattered little in the moment. Control had been imposed on the body, regardless of intent. These perspectives, human, leadership, and moral, only begin to capture the full complexity of the situation. The technological and logistical dimensions of hygiene, as well as the reactions of enemy propagandists and the psychological coping strategies of prisoners, provide additional layers of understanding. Each angle reveals a different facet of the same event, deepening our comprehension of what it meant to live through these procedures. The mass haircuts in POW camps were not a matter of casual scissors or makeshift tools. They were part of a carefully planned system designed to prevent disease on a large scale. Camp administrators relied on established public health practices, drawn from military experience and civilian hygiene protocols. Clippers, combs, and disinfectant solutions were organized in stations. Officers scheduled haircuts in shifts, ensuring that hundreds of women could be processed efficiently without compromising the camp's overall sanitation. Hot water, soap, and chemical treatments were used to remove lice, and sometimes entire barracks were fumigated following the procedure. The uniforms, bedding, and personal clothing of prisoners were often disinfected in tandem. In many ways, these actions mirrored practices used in military barracks, hospitals, and refugee centers, standardized methods aimed at preventing outbreaks. For camp staff, the process was routine, almost clinical. The technological aspect, the tools, disinfectants, and methods, underscored the tension between efficiency and human dignity. While the procedure's goal was medical, the result for prisoners was deeply personal. Hair, a private expression of identity, became subject to regimented control. The treatment of German women in POW camps did not go unnoticed by German authorities. Propaganda organs within the collapsing Reich seized upon the stories of haircutting and sanitation procedures, framing them as acts of humiliation imposed by the Allies. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and local bulletins described women stripped of dignity, their appearance forcibly altered by foreign captors. These narratives emphasized outrage and injustice, designed to galvanize civilian sentiment and sustain morale even as defeat loomed. For the Allies, these accusations were largely dismissed or minimized. Camp administrators focused on public health and security rather than optics. Yet the interplay of propaganda created a dual narrative. Within the camps, procedures were framed as medical necessity. Outside, they became a symbol of subjugation in the eyes of the German public. This angle highlights the way simple, practical measures could be interpreted as acts of power, fueling tensions between military intent and perception. The psychological impact of enforced haircuts was immediate and enduring. Prisoners experienced a profound loss of control over their own bodies. Diaries and testimonies from former POWs describe the acute stress of standing in line, waiting for scissors to snip away hair that had been a part of their identity for years. Some reacted with tears or quiet resistance. Others accepted it with stoic resignation. Small acts of solidarity, helping each other during the process, whispering reassurances, or sharing scarves, became vital coping mechanisms. Long-term effects were documented in post-war interviews. Women recalled persistent feelings of vulnerability, embarrassment, and diminished self-esteem. For many, the act of haircutting became emblematic of broader wartime trauma, the moment when private autonomy was overridden by institutional authority. Psychologists analyzing wartime captivity later noted that such seemingly minor humiliations could have lasting effects on self-perception and trust, particularly when combined with the constant stress of confinement. Examining these angles together, human, leadership, moral, technological, propaganda, and psychological, reveals the multi-layered complexity of what might appear to be a simple act. Yet it was within the convergence of these perspectives that the event's significance truly emerges. The moment the women were gathered for their haircuts, all these forces intersected: fear and defiance, order and control, necessity and humiliation. This sets the stage for the climax, the point at which theory and policy became reality, and the women's experiences crystallized into a moment. March 1945. The winter's grip had begun to loosen across northern France, but the air in the POW camp remained sharp and cold. Inside the wooden barracks, rows of women stood shoulder to shoulder, their breaths forming clouds in the frosty air. The order had come the night before. All prisoners must have their hair cut. The reason, according to the camp officers, was hygiene, but for the women, the implications were far more personal. Scissors gleamed under the dim light as the barbers moved methodically down the rows. Nurses applied disinfectant, the pungent smell mixing with the metallic tang of the cold barracks. Women clutched their braids, some whispering prayers, others speaking in low murmurs to comfort one another. The tension was palpable. Each snip of the scissors felt like an erasure of the life they had once known. The process was swift, almost mechanical. In some barracks, hundreds were processed in a single day. Officers observed from raised platforms, noting compliance, ensuring order, and inspecting heads for lice. The women's reactions varied. Some cried quietly, hidden behind scarves or hands. Others sat rigidly, lips pressed together, attempting to maintain dignity. Even small gestures, tilting the head slightly, holding a braid close, became acts of self-possession in the face of institutional authority. Beyond the immediate physical act, the environment amplified the intensity. The wooden floors echoed with the sound of clippers, metal combs, and whispered sobs. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter, a reminder of the impossibility of escape. The women had little choice but to submit, yet within that submission, small expressions of humanity endured. Older prisoners offered reassurance, a hand on a shoulder, a comforting word. Younger women, often overwhelmed, drew strength from the solidarity around them. In some camps, the procedure became an almost ritualized moment of tension. Officers documented the process carefully: who had complied, who had resisted, and who required further treatment. For the women, each step carried symbolic weight. Hair, a private expression of femininity, was transformed into a marker of captivity. Braids were cut to stubs. Once long hair fell to the floor in piles. The visual impact was immediate. Rows of women, heads shaved or unevenly trimmed, facing one another in shared humiliation. The emotional intensity did not dissipate with the final snip. Observers noted the way women clutched their remaining strands, the whispered conversations attempting to make sense of the experience, the fleeting moments of defiance or stoic endurance. It was a turning point not only in their immediate lives, but also in the way the camp's authority asserted itself. The haircut was more than a hygiene measure. It was a demonstration of control, a vivid reminder of captivity, and a point at which private identity collided with institutional power. Reports from Allied officers later described the process in clinical terms, emphasizing efficiency and health outcomes. Yet these same documents acknowledged the visible distress among prisoners. Nurses and barbers, though tasked with enforcing the order, often recognized the psychological weight of the act. Some made quiet efforts to offer reassurance, while others adhered strictly to protocol, prioritizing the camp's operational needs over emotional considerations. For the women, the climax of the haircut was both immediate and enduring. In the short term, it established the routine of camp life, reinforcing authority and setting expectations. In the long term, it became a defining memory of their imprisonment, an event that would be recounted decades later in diaries, letters, and interviews. The combination of fear, humiliation, solidarity, and resilience created a moment that encapsulated the complex human experience of captivity. As the last of the scissors fell silent and the barbers packed their tools, the women looked at one another, shorn, shivering, yet unbroken. In that charged silence, the convergence of policy, necessity, and human endurance was complete. It was a moment that would resonate far beyond the walls of the barracks, shaping memories, narratives, and the understanding of wartime captivity. This pivotal moment, where order met humanity, sets the stage for the second part of the climax, the broader consequences, observations of the officers, and the immediate ripple effects throughout the camp. As the mass haircut procedure drew to a close, the immediate atmosphere in the camp shifted. Silence replaced the buzz of clippers, and the women stood in rows, heads lowered, confronting both the physical reality of their shorn hair and the symbolic weight it carried. The camp officers conducted their final inspections, moving slowly down each line, checking for lice, cleanliness, and compliance. Any remaining hesitation was met with quiet, authoritative reminders. Obedience was not optional. Observers noted the paradox of the moment. A strictly organized procedure intended to prevent disease simultaneously exposed the depth of human vulnerability. Some women avoided eye contact. Others fidgeted with the collars of their uniform jackets. A few whispered short prayers or murmured encouragement to one another. The emotional resonance was unmistakable. Fear, embarrassment, and helplessness coexisted with resilience, solidarity, and quiet defiance. These small acts of mutual support provided a subtle counterpoint to the institutional authority surrounding them. Reports from Allied officers described the aftermath of the haircuts with clinical precision. In one camp, more than 400 women were processed in a single day. Lice infestations were reduced, hygiene improved, and the daily routine became more manageable for camp staff. Yet beyond the statistics, the psychological and social consequences were evident. Guards observed shifts in prisoner behavior. Some became withdrawn, others more compliant, while a few attempted minor forms of resistance, such as hiding hair remnants or discreetly braiding what little remained. The procedure also affected the camp leadership itself. Officers and nurses, though following orders, were acutely aware of the moral complexity. Some kept notes on the visible distress among prisoners, reflecting privately on the balance between necessity and compassion. Discussions among staff revealed tension between operational efficiency and empathy. Even within the rigid hierarchy of the camp, the haircuts prompted reflection. How far should authority extend into the intimate lives of prisoners? How could policy maintain public health without eroding human dignity? The broader camp environment responded to this turning point. Women, now sharing the common experience of enforced haircuts, began forming informal support networks more visibly. Older prisoners took on mentoring roles. Younger women learned to navigate their new appearances, and small communities coalesced within the barracks. These acts of human connection became survival mechanisms, offering psychological resilience in a context defined by control and restriction. Meanwhile, the German authorities outside the camps amplified the story for propaganda purposes. Newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasized the humiliation of German women at the hands of Allied forces, portraying the haircuts as emblematic of a broader injustice. Within Germany, these narratives fueled resentment and outrage, creating a tension between the Allies' practical intentions and the enemy's portrayal of the events. For the women themselves, the external reactions were largely irrelevant. Their experience was immediate, personal, and emotionally charged. By the end of the day, the haircut had transformed the dynamic of the camp. What had begun as a logistical procedure became a defining moment of captivity, a point where personal autonomy, institutional authority, hygiene, and human resilience intersected. The women were no longer merely prisoners. They were witnesses to the collision of policy and human dignity. This moment also foreshadowed the broader consequences that would unfold in the aftermath. Physical health was preserved, yes, but the emotional and social ramifications persisted long after the scissors fell silent. Bonds formed in shared adversity, memories of humiliation lingered, and the experience became a touchstone for understanding the intersection of war, control, and identity. The stage is now set for examining the aftermath, where we will explore the short-term and long-term consequences of these events, how the women coped, how camp authorities and German society responded, and how these experiences shaped both personal and historical narratives. In the days following the haircuts, life inside the camps settled into a new rhythm, but the effects of the procedure lingered. For many women, the immediate consequences were both physical and emotional. Hair, once a personal emblem of identity and femininity, had been stripped away, leaving a visible reminder of captivity. Some women experienced scalp irritation from disinfectants, while others felt a lingering sense of vulnerability whenever they encountered the guards or fellow prisoners. The loss was not merely cosmetic. It was a tangible marker of control, a daily reminder that even small, intimate aspects of life were subject to authority. Testimonies from former prisoners highlight the profound emotional impact. Women wrote of initial shame, feelings of exposure, and the humiliation of being visually distinct from their pre-war selves. Yet, alongside the discomfort, moments of resilience emerged. Shared experiences forged bonds among prisoners. Women comforted one another, exchanged scarves or makeshift head coverings, and developed informal routines to regain a sense of personal control. These acts of solidarity became crucial in navigating the psychological challenges of camp life, providing a small measure of dignity in an environment dominated by rules and oversight. From the perspective of camp administration, the immediate aftermath was largely measured in operational terms. Hygiene inspections showed marked reductions in lice infestations. Sanitation standards improved, contributing to a decline in minor illnesses and infections. Officers noted greater ease in managing barracks, as short hair reduced maintenance burdens and allowed for more efficient monitoring of health conditions. Official reports emphasized compliance rates, noting that while some resistance occurred, the vast majority of prisoners adhered to orders without incident. The external response from German communities was mixed but significant. News of haircutting procedures reached family members and local newspapers, often framed as humiliation at the hands of the Allies. For civilians in Germany, these accounts reinforced narratives of suffering and injustice, particularly in the final months of the war when morale was already fragile. Propaganda leveraged these stories to cultivate anger and resentment, portraying the women's experience as symbolic of the broader plight of Germany's population under Allied occupation. Within the camp, the social dynamics among prisoners also shifted. The shared experience of enforced haircuts created a collective identity, blending feelings of vulnerability with solidarity. Older women often took on protective roles, guiding younger prisoners in coping strategies or offering reassurance during inspections. Quiet acts of resistance emerged. A whispered joke, a small act of personal grooming, or discreet conversations aimed at retaining a sense of autonomy. These subtle behaviors, often overlooked in official reports, became vital tools for psychological survival. This immediate aftermath, balancing practical hygiene improvements with emotional consequences, highlights the dual nature of the haircutting experience. On one hand, it achieved its intended purpose: disease control, streamlined camp management, and adherence to sanitary protocol. On the other, it left a lasting impression on the prisoners themselves, shaping their perception of captivity and influencing interactions, morale, and resilience in the days and weeks that followed. The next section will examine the longer-term effects, the enduring psychological impact, the responses of Allied authorities, and the broader societal implications. It will also consider how the experience of these women contributed to post-war narratives of survival, memory, and historical documentation, bridging the personal and the collective. As weeks and months passed, the effects of the haircutting procedures extended beyond the immediate confines of the camp. For many women, the psychological impact persisted long after liberation. Hair, a deeply personal marker of identity and femininity, had been forcibly removed, leaving a lasting sense of vulnerability. In post-war interviews, former prisoners recounted feelings of shame, disorientation, and the challenge of reconciling their camp experiences with their lives outside. Even when clothing, shelter, and nourishment were restored, the memory of that intimate loss remained vivid, a symbolic scar of captivity. The social consequences were equally significant. Upon returning to their communities, some women faced questions, stares, or subtle judgment from family and neighbors who struggled to understand the experiences of captivity. Yet these same women often demonstrated remarkable resilience. Many rebuilt their lives, gradually reclaiming agency over appearance, personal routines, and social roles. Shared narratives of survival became a source of communal identity, linking former prisoners through memory and testimony. Letters, memoirs, and post-war interviews document how these women processed their experiences, balancing humiliation with pride in their endurance. From an administrative perspective, the haircutting policy prompted reflection within Allied authorities. While the immediate goal, preventing lice and maintaining hygiene, had been achieved, staff and commanders recognized the need for sensitivity in handling prisoners. Reports from the period indicate debates over how to implement sanitary measures without unnecessary emotional trauma. These discussions contributed to evolving approaches in post-war POW management and humanitarian practices, informing policies on treatment of civilians and prisoners in subsequent conflicts. Historians examining the period note that such practices highlight the intersection of military necessity, public health, and human dignity. Haircutting, while seemingly minor in the larger scope of global conflict, reveals the ways in which ordinary people, particularly women, were drawn into the machinery of war. The procedure became a symbol of captivity itself, a tangible, visible reminder that war extends far beyond battlefields, reaching into intimate aspects of daily life. The broader societal impact extended even further. German media and propaganda leveraged stories of shorn women to reinforce narratives of Allied oppression, influencing post-war memory and public perception. Conversely, Allied accounts emphasized efficiency and health, often downplaying the emotional dimension. This divergence illustrates how the same event can carry multiple meanings, depending on perspective. For the women themselves, however, the experience was unequivocally personal, an intersection of shame, resilience, and survival that would shape memory and identity for decades. In the final analysis, the aftermath of the haircutting procedures underscores a central truth about wartime captivity. Practical measures can carry profound human consequences. The physical act of cutting hair was intertwined with control, compliance, and survival, leaving lasting impressions that reached far beyond the barracks. The women's endurance, quiet defiance, and mutual support in navigating this experience offer a window into the broader human capacity to adapt and survive, even under circumstances that strip away personal autonomy. This reflection on the immediate and long-term aftermath naturally leads to a broader contemplation of meaning. What does this episode tell us about humanity, war, and dignity? How should we remember the experiences of those who endured these intimate humiliations? These questions set the stage for the final section of the documentary, a measured, philosophical closure that situates the events within history and memory. The story of German women prisoners of war, their hair forcibly cut in the name of hygiene, is both intimate and expansive. On one level, it is a simple act, a haircut intended to prevent lice, maintain cleanliness, and manage large numbers of prisoners in confined spaces. On another level, it is deeply human, a collision of authority and personal identity, of necessity and dignity. These moments remind us that war reaches far beyond the battlefield. It touches the smallest, most private corners of life, leaving echoes that persist long after the guns have fallen silent. For the women who endured these procedures, the experience was transformative. Hair, a symbol of individuality and femininity, was reduced to uniformity under institutional control. The loss was immediate and visible, yet it also revealed resilience. Bonds of solidarity, whispered words of comfort, and small acts of self-possession became vital threads of humanity. The act of enduring, quietly resisting, and supporting one another stands as a testament to the human spirit under duress. From a historical perspective, these events highlight the complexity of wartime ethics and administration. Allied forces sought to balance health, safety, and order with the treatment of prisoners. The haircutting policy, while practical, also exposed the tension between operational necessity and moral responsibility, a tension that resonates in discussions of wartime conduct even today. Ultimately, this episode serves as a lens through which we can examine the broader consequences of war, the way it reshapes lives, tests dignity, and leaves indelible marks on memory. It reminds us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in the quiet moments of endurance, in the faces of those who survive the ordinary humiliations of extraordinary times. As the world moves forward, the stories of these women endure, not merely as records of captivity, but as lessons in resilience, empathy, and the enduring need to preserve humanity, even amidst the harshest conditions. Their experience challenges us to consider how the smallest acts of control can carry profound weight, and how, even in adversity, human dignity can quietly persist.